we've now finished up our list screen, which is a great little example of our flat list component. Now, before we move on to our next screen that we're going to put together, I want to do a little bit of busy work or a little bit of administrative work on our application. So at present, we have 3 different screens worth of content that a user can see. But right now, there's no way for a user to navigate between these different screens. If you open up your app.js file, you'll recall that inside of here, there's an object with a initial route name property. And that property right there decides what screen is going to be visible when our application first starts up. Right now it's set to list. If we change it to home, it's going to now show this home screen. So if I now save this, the default screen that we see is the home screen instead. So in this next series of videos, I would love if we figured out a better way to show all the different screens that we're putting together, so that we do not have to always be changing this prop right here or this property anytime we want to show some different content. So to do so, I want to turn that home screen into kind of a different experience. When our application first boots up, we should always show the home screen by default. But at the same time, on the home screen, I want to add in 2 different buttons. One button a user should be able to tap to go to the component screen, and a user should be able to tap this other button to go to the list screen. So pulling this off is really going to be 2 different steps. The first thing we're going to have to do is figure out how to place 2 buttons on our home screen. We're going to have to figure out how to detect whenever a user taps on either this button or this button. The second thing we're going to have to do is figure out how to actually navigate a user from the home screen over to components or list. So that's what we're going to work on in this video and the next couple. So the first thing we need to do, like I said, we need to show some buttons on the screen. Now showing a button is going to be a little bit more complicated than you might think. Let me tell you why. In the world of React Native, if you take a look at the documentation, you'll see that there's actually 2 different ways of showing a button to a user. There's one primitive element. Remember, a primitive element is something that we import from the React Native library, and it's called button. This primitive element, as you might guess, is going to show a very simple button component. This has very little customization features tied to it, and essentially it's just going to show something that a user can tap, and it has the ability to tell you and I as developers whenever a user taps on this button. The other element that we have access to make a button is something called touchable opacity. This is a very customizable primitive component, and it allows us to essentially detect a press event, or like a user tapping on something, on just about any kind of element inside of our application. So that could be like a piece of text, or an image, or just about anything else. So we've got a button component for very simple interactions, and a touchable opacity for kind of like more complex interactions. Just so you know why there's these 2 separate things, it used to be in earlier versions of React Native, there was only this touchable opacity thing. But a lot of people were coming into the React Native world and saying, hey, how do I show a button? Because the name touchable opacity doesn't really make it seem like it's a button at all, right? So eventually the React Native team kind of caved in and said, okay, we'll create a very simple button so you can show a button, but there's not going to be a lot of customization options tied to it. So that's why there's these 2 different ways of showing a button to a user. Okay, so with that in mind, let's take a pause right here. When we come back to the next video, we're going to work on our home screen, and we're going to try to show a button using that button primitive and the touchable opacity primitive as well. So quick pause, and I'll see you in just a minute. In this video, we're going to figure out how to show a button element on our home screen. This button element is going to show the text, Go to Components Demo. And eventually when a user taps on it, we're going to navigate that user over to the component screen. So let's give this a shot. I'm going to flip back over to my code editor. I'm already inside of my homescreen.js file. Now, as a quick aside here, I just want to mention very quickly, inside my app.js file, I also changed that initial route name in the last video. I did it very quickly, but I just want to remind you that I changed initial route name to be home instead. So now when my application starts up, I'm going to see the home screen by default. All right, so now inside my home screen file, at the very top, I'm going to import view and button. I'm only importing view right now because I'm going to use it to wrap this text element and a button that I'm about to place as well. Remember, from a React component by default, we only return a single root element. So I'm going to use the view to wrap that text and that button. I'll first get started by wrapping that text element with the view. As a quick reminder, if you had a semicolon at the end of that line of text, it needs to be cleaned up. If you save this file as is, you're going to see an error saying that you've got some piece of text outside of a text element. because the semicolon inside of JSX is interpreted as being a piece of text that you want to print out. So I'm going to clean up that semicolon. I'll then save the file just to make sure that I don't have any errors. Okay, very good. So now, right after that text element, I'm going to place a button element. A button is a self-closing element, so notice how I don't have any separate closing tag for the button. Instead, I've got a single / and then a greater than sign right after it. When we show a button, we're not going to pass in some text we want to show inside of it, like so. We don't do that. Instead, to show some text inside of a button element, we're going to pass it a prop called title. So I'm going to pass in a title prop, and it's going to be a string. In JSX, we can designate a string or pass a string to a prop without using those red curly brackets. This is one of the very few exceptions when we're trying to assign a value to a prop. For just about every other type of value, we're always going to use those red curly brackets. But for strings, we can simply use double quotes like so. So I'm going to give this button a title of exactly what our mockup showed back over here. So go to components demo. Go to components demo. If I then save that, I'll see the button appear on the screen. Looks good. So that's the default styling of a button. If you're on Android, you're going to see the default styling looking like so. So the button element is going to change how it looks depending upon the platform that you're running on. If you're on Android, you're going to get a very typical looking Android button. And if you're on iOS, you're going to get that nice kind of blue text button instead. So just showing a button is not quite enough to actually add anything to our application. We also want to have the ability to run some code or essentially handle whenever a user taps on this thing as well. So to run some code or respond to a user tapping on that button, we can add in an additional prop to the button element. To get started, I'm going to first put a new line inside of here just to give myself a little bit more space. And then either before or after, it doesn't make a difference, the title prop, we're going to add in another prop called onPress. Now this is a very special prop, just like title is. Notice how I have on and then capital P for press. If you change the spelling of this prop, it's not going to work appropriately. The button element expects to be passed a prop called specifically onPress with exactly that capitalization. When we designate the onPress prop, we then pass it a function. This function is going to be called anytime a user, as you might guess, presses that button. So for right now, let's just try doing a console log inside of here. So I'll do console log button pressed, like so. So now in theory, whenever we press on that button, we should see a console log appear. So I'll save this and then press on the button 1 or 2 times. But I don't immediately see a console log appear anywhere. So where do console logs appear when we're running React Native? Well, they always appear in the same terminal window that's running your React Native packager. So if I flip back over to my terminal and find the window that's running my packager, I'll see the console logs right here from the 3 times that I just pressed that button. I can do the same thing on Android as well. So on Android, I'll tap on that button a couple times, go back over to my terminal, and I can see some additional number of console logs. Okay, so that's how we use a simple button primitive with React Native. Again, a button primitive is a very simple component. It's really just going to show a button without really a lot more customization options. We can change some simple styling options around this thing, but for anything more advanced, we usually end up wanting to use that other kind of component for detecting presses called that touchable opacity thing. So let's take another quick pause right here. When we come back to the next video, we're going to figure out how to use the touchable opacity instead. We're just going to do this as kind of like a counterpoint so you can see both different approaches. So quick pause and I'll see you in just a minute. We've now seen an example of the very simple button element. Now we're going to go through the same process with a touchable opacity. Touchable opacity works slightly differently, but chances are you're going to end up using touchable opacity in a lot of your applications more frequently than you're going to use a button. So let's give this a shot. I'll flip back over to my home screen component, and at the top I'm going to add in an import for touchable opacity from React Native as well. Then right after my button, I'm going to place a touchable opacity. A touchable opacity is not a self-closing element, so notice how I put down an opening and a closing tab. Then inside of here, we're going to add in some number of elements. Whenever a user taps on any of the elements inside of here, the touchable opacity will detect that tap and give us some kind of notification. in the form of a onPress event, just like the one we assigned to button right there. So in this case, I'm going to add in a text element inside of the touchable opacity. I'll then give it some text like about, what do we show in our mockup back over here? Go to list demo. Let's do that. Go to list demo. Okay, so let's save this as is and see what happens. So I can now see that text up here in my application. Notice how by default, that text gets no styling. So that's one benefit to using the button element. The button element by default has some nice styling tied to it. If I now tap on that text, you'll notice that it kind of fades out very briefly and then comes back in. That behavior is added in by the touchable opacity. The word opacity inside there indicates that whenever you tap on an element that is listed inside of touchable opacity, it's going to very briefly kind of fade out. The idea there is that it's going to give some feedback to our users and let them know that, hey, you just tapped on like that thing right there. This automatic kind of fade effect is going to work on any kind of element that we put inside of a touchable opacity. So if we also put in, say, some kind of image or an icon, and then tapped on it, it would have a very similar fade out effect. So that's kind of a nice benefit to using the touchable opacity. We can show any kind of element inside of it, and if a user taps on it, they're going to get an immediate little piece of feedback. So now to detect a press event, we're going to assign an onPress prop, just like we did for our button, to the touchable opacity. So inside of touchable opacity on the opening tag, I'll say onPress. I'll then assign an arrow function. And I'll do a console log inside of here for right now as well. And for this one, I'll say list pressed, like so. So I'll save that. And now if I tap on that text and then flip back over to my terminal window, I'll see list pressed. Perfect. All right. So this is a very simple demonstration of some of the differences between button and touchable opacity. The big difference is that a button is going to essentially just show some pre-styled text inside of it, and that's pretty much it. The touchable opacity, on the other hand, is going to allow us to put in any kind of element we want inside of here. We could even put in multiple elements if we wanted to. So for example, if for some crazy reason we want to have like multiple pieces of text, those will all be displayed. Let me get my emulator back up here really quickly. There we go. All three pieces of text are displayed, and if I tap on any of them, that entire block of text is going to fade out. Now obviously, having like multiple pieces of text fade out or be pressable is not super useful, but you might imagine that maybe you want to have like a really big image that a user can press on, and maybe also have like a piece of text like a title underneath it. And whenever a user tapped on either the image or that piece of text, maybe we would want to respond to that. And the touchable opacity would be perfect for that. So right now, we're just kind of trying to get a better idea of how the touchable opacity works, but we're going to get some good examples of the power of it in some later applications that we put together. Okay, so now we've seen both our button and our touchable opacity. The last thing we have to do is figure out how to navigate a user over to the components demo or the list demo whenever they tap on it. So we'll figure out how to handle that navigation in the next video. The last thing we have to do for our home screen is make sure that a user can tap on either this button or this touchable opacity and get navigated over to the appropriate screen. So in this video, we're going to figure out exactly how to do that. And the first thing I want to remind you about is that inside of our app.js file, this project came pre-configured with this stack navigator thing. This stack navigator is what's going to allow us to navigate or essentially change the content that is visible on the screen to our users. Let's talk about how we can directly manipulate this stack navigator. Okay, so quick diagram. So on the left-hand side of this diagram is our stack navigator. This is an object, like I said, it decides what to show on the screen at any given point in time. So the stack navigator itself is responsible for deciding to show home screen, list, or component screen. When the stack navigator shows any one of these different components, it renders it, and in the process, it passes down a set of configuration options. Remember, we refer to these different configuration options as props. At this point, we've only seen an example of props that we pass into a primitive component. So for example, inside of our home screen file, you and I passed in a prop to that text element of style. And here's a prop we passed into button of onPress, one for title, and so on. Props are not limited to just primitive elements created by React Native, however. Components that you and I create, such as our home screen or list screen or whatever else, can also receive props as well. So in React, we can both pass props in, which is what you're seeing right here, and we can also receive configuration options or props into a component that we create. When the Stack Navigator shows one of our components and passes in that props object, the props object has a lot of different properties tied to it. One of the properties inside there is a function that we can call inside of our code and tell the Stack Navigator that we want it to change some content that is visible on the screen. So let's first try to just receive this props object inside of our home screen component. We'll do a console log of the props object and just kind of inspect some of the different properties or different options that we're given inside of our home screen. Okay, so back inside of our home screen, I'm going to find const home screen, the function declaration right up here at the top. Whenever a component that you and I create is passed a props object, it always shows up as the first argument to this function. So we usually call this props like so. Then inside of our function body, we can console log out that props object. So now anytime that our home screen appears on our device, as it is right here, we should see this console log appear in our terminal at the same exact time. Okay, so I'm going to save this. If I now flip back over to my terminal, I'll see that console log. So this big console log right here is all the different properties that exist inside of that props object. Now reading this console log is a little bit challenging, so let me just walk you through it very quickly. This is essentially saying that we've got a props object, like that's the top level object right there. And then inside that object, there is a navigation property. The navigation property points to an object, and that navigation object has keys of actions, add event listener, dangerously get parent, dismiss, dismatch, and so on. So everything that you're seeing inside this console log right here is all nested inside of navigation. So in other words, just to make sure it's really clear, we could update this console log of props to props.navigation like so, and then we'll just see that inner object. So I'll save this once again, flip back over, and now if we scroll down a little bit, we should see a second console log. There it is right there. And now we're seeing a console log of just the props.navigation object. Just to be clear, this navigation property, like this entire object right here, is added in specifically by that React navigation library, or more specifically by the Stack Navigator that we're making use of. So a normal React component is not going to be just magically provided some big navigation object. Instead, it is specifically given to us because our component is being shown by that Stack Navigator. All right, so with that in mind, if we now look really carefully inside this object, you'll notice that inside of here, there's one very specific property inside of here, and it's called navigate. Navigate is a function that we can use to change the content that is visible on the screen of our device. We can call this navigation, or this navigate function, with a string. If we pass in a string that matches one of the different route names that are defined inside of our app.js file, let's flip over there really quickly. So here's app.js. Here's our route object right here that describes all the different routes that we can navigate to inside of our application. So we can call that navigate function and pass in a string of home, or components, or list. When we do so, we'll then see the appropriate component appear on the screen immediately. And that's pretty much it. That's the whole ballgame. Okay, so let's now test this out. To test it out, I'm going to go back over to my home screen component. I'm going to clean up that console log that we have right there. And I'm going to find my button and replace the console log inside there. So not the entire function, just the console log. I'll replace it with props.navigation.navigate. Again, that's a function that we can call, and we can pass in a string that points to one of these other routes that we've defined inside of our Stack Navigator. So in this case, their button says go to components demo, so we probably want to navigate over to components. So inside the navigate function, I'll put in a string with components like so. And that's pretty much it. So let's now save this and we'll test out our application. I should now be able to tap on go to components demo and I'll see some navigation automatically occur. So now we are seeing our components demo screen or component visible. And you'll notice inside the header, React Navigation, that's the library we are using to show different content, has automatically added in a back button right there. And if I tap on that back button, I go back to the original home screen. Okay, so this is perfect. This is exactly what we wanted. I should be able to replicate all this on my Android device as well. So if I tap on Go to Components Demo, Yep, I navigate over, and then in the header right there, I've automatically got a back button that I can tap and go back to my home screen. Perfect. Okay, so let's take a quick pause right here. When we come back to the next video, we're going to add in the same functionality to our touchable opacity as well. We've now got the ability to navigate over to our component screen. So now we're going to add the same thing into our touchable opacity. The code we're going to write for this is going to be just about identical to what we added into button. So I'll find the onPress callback right here. Remember, this is a function that gets ran anytime a user taps on any element inside of touchable opacity. I'll then remove that console log, and I'll replace it with props.navigation.navigate, and then as a string, we'll put the name of the route that we want to show. So the list screen has a route name of list with a capital L. So back over here, we'll call navigate and put in list with a capital L as well. Okay, so we'll save this, test it out really quickly. I can now tap on Go to List Demo and see our list screen appear. Perfect. I can go back to my home screen, and I can now navigate between all three of these different screens very easily. And just to show it on Android as well, yep, works over here too. Okay, so this looks great. Now the last thing I want to do, even though I wanted to show you both the button element and the touchable opacity, for our home screen, it's kind of strange to have two very different types or stylings of buttons appear. So the last thing I want to do is refactor this touchable opacity into a button as well. Remember, in general, the button element is a little bit less powerful and has way fewer configuration options available to it. But for this particular case, well, we really just plain want to show a button for the list demo link, I think. So I'm going to add in a second button element here. I'll give it a title of Go to List Demo. And then I'll add in a onPress prop. Remember, we're going to give that thing a arrow function like so. And then inside there, we can call props.navigation.navigate. And we want to navigate to list. And now we can clean up our touchable opacity. So I'm going to delete that entirely. All right, so now we should be able to save this, flip back over, and yep, there we go. We've got both of them, and they look pretty reasonable. Now on iOS, there's a very clear separation there, but on Android, those two buttons are right next to each other. So we'll eventually come back and add in a little bit of styling to this home screen, but for right now, we just need to be a little bit careful about which button we actually press. Okay, so that's pretty much it. Now, last thing I want to mention here is that inside of our onPress functions, we have some very similar looking calls. In both cases, we have props.navigation.navigate, and same thing down here as well. So if we want to, we could use a little feature out of ES 2015 JavaScript to slightly condense the code we've written here. Notice how we don't have any other reference to this props argument inside of our function. The only thing we are receiving this props argument for is to refer to that navigation property. So if we wanted to, we could refactor this by deleting props right there, putting in a set of parentheses, and then a set of curly braces inside there. We can then write out the word navigation. So this is referred to as destructuring, and we're essentially pulling off just the navigation property from that props object. We no longer have access to the props object inside of here. Instead, we have access only to the navigation one. So that means we can shorten up both props.navigation right here to be just navigation.navigate. And we can do the same thing for the second one as well, just navigation.navigate. So that just saves us having to write out that word props a ton of times inside of this component. We're going to use this pattern quite a bit throughout the course because very, very seldom do we ever want to receive the entire props object. Usually we just want to pull like one or two properties off of it. Okay, so I'll save this again just to make sure everything works. And yep, still looks good. Okay, so this is fantastic. Let's take a quick pause right here and move on to the next topic in the next video.